Hi guys. Again, I despise doing videos that have anything to do with fads or anything uber popular or anything that can be construed as being part of pop culture. I abhor it. Just on principle, I don't want anything to do with it. But I recognize that this particular event is a big deal and it should probably be talked about. And I do have an opinion on it, so I might as well bestow my wisdom upon thee. This is, of course, about the situation with Milo Yiannopoulos himself. Despite the fact that I was going to try not to talk about him anymore because it's infuriating and it gets old really, really fast. I don't really plan to go into too much depth on the events themselves that transpired because I'm sure everybody knows what happened. These things that he said are things that he said a long time ago, and there was very little outrage until recently. Does that correspond with the fact that he was due to speak at CPAC very soon? I don't know. That's not for me to say, although I don't think it's a coincidence that this super incriminating and just super unbelievably foolish thing that he said multiple times to multiple people is now being used against him. If you consider the sources, the kind of people who are outing Milo, or the kind of publications that are currently outing Milo, said nothing about Lena Dunham, did nothing to contact or be sympathetic toward or advocate for Elijah Wood or Macaulay Culkin when they talked about all of the abuse of children in Hollywood and in those kind of elite circles. They didn't say anything. Did I mention Lena Dunham? Who admits in her book, and in my opinion actually brags about, having, sexually abused her infant sister and grooming her in a way that she likens to how a predator would groom a child that they plan to molest. The fact that there is this huge disconnect between the way kind of mainstream liberal people have been treated and how an uber conservative, if you will, has been treated is glaring, and I think it speaks for itself. That doesn't, however, make what he said any less reprehensible. It's pretty embarrassing to realize that I hate to look at it in that kind of polarizing way, but we as a movement, as sort of a political affiliation, as the, center to far right, are just as completely beside ourselves and out of our minds at the label of pedophile as the left is with Nazis. Nazism is repulsive and reprehensible, and pedophilia is repulsive and not just reprehensible, it's utterly evil and sick and disgusting. And the fact that I have to even give that disclaimer as to my stance on such things speaks to what a horrifically morally bankrupt state we are in as Western society as a whole. Sorry. I'm trying to do this in one take because you're going to be able to tell if I don't, because my jellies will be changing colors. We have been as reactionary at the mere accusation of somebody being something horrible as the left is when somebody is accused of being a Nazi, for example, or, a white nationalist, anything of that nature. There has been an astounding lack of pragmatism, of sort of emotional distancing in order to be analytical. And I don't just mean that people rushed to condemn him, although people who despise Milo certainly have done that, but people who adore him rushed to his defense without really looking at what has been said or done. And that is also an illustration of the fact that both sides are culpable here in this intellectual laziness, this willful ignorance. I actually really did used to like Milo. I really, really did admire him for a while. I mean, his accent is just fantastic. He is a very sharp dresser, of course. He is charismatic in sort of a supervillain type way. He's very cute, and he's very intelligent and makes the arguments that everybody wants to hear made, but may not say because they're too polite, or they're a little too extreme, or because they're the kinds of things you would say to hurt somebody or shut somebody up that you don't really truly believe, or at least not to that extreme. And as time went on, it kind of became a little bit more obvious that Milo doesn't really have good intentions. And I understand that you cannot force somebody to adhere to your morals. I'm not trying to say that he can be condemned objectively because he does not you know, adhere or live up to my standards for a role model or a speaker or a conservative or whatever. But it became pretty apparent, over time that Milo is not really interested in doing any good. It was demonstrated by the fact that while he warned that the ultra-left, or progressives, if you will, that they would be violent, that they would begin to justify any means of silencing and intimidating people that they disagreed with, that they were completely irrational, emotion-driven. If you think of all of the people who have become, immortalized in the memes, that hang above us and watch over us as we sleep. And you look at the riots that happened at, was it Berkeley, where he spoke? You look at Trigglypuff, poor girl. You look at all of these people who have done exactly what he said and what he characterized the extremist social justice, progressive type people as. But you notice that he's not dismayed when this happens. You notice he's not sympathetic. When a campus that's occupied by both conservatives and liberals is destroyed in riots, you will notice that Milo is not sympathetic for all of the people who are innocent bystanders, whose property is being destroyed, whose taxes are going to be going up because they need to repair all of this stuff, whose health, whose physical and mental well-being is at stake because people are destroying property and creating extremely dangerous environments everywhere. He's gleeful when people do exactly what he says they're going to do. Milo's in this for himself. You can also see this, and I hate to go this route, but Glenn Beck, who I watched a lot when I was younger and who my parents both have listened to, always talked about pivot points. And it's like such a stupid, like, Glenn Beck term that he made up. But what he means are turning points or epiphanies. If you drastically change your stance on something, if you drastically change your outlook on any aspect of life, and there was not a turning point, there was not one point or a series of events that you can identify that triggered this, that were a catalyst for that change in you, it's extremely unlikely that it's authentic, that you are not changing your stance on something in order to receive some kind of personal gain, which is a completely sound principle in my mind. Not to sound cynical, but people who are outspoken and who market their ideas and their philosophies, as a living, as the way they pay their bills and acquire food and shelter, do not change their opinions drastically without having seen something or researched something or experiencing something that created that change or facilitated that change. And this happened with Milo and gamers. When he was early on, I believe, in his tech career, he, belittled gamers as the stereotypical, have no sex lives, are completely socially inept. He went from that stereotype to, championing the outspoken leaders of Gamergate and saying that gaming is one of the greatest bastions of free speech left. When before that became kind of a conservatively or right-wing co-opted talking point, he didn't have that opinion. If there was a pivot point there at all, it was that it became profitable for him to take that stance because it was popular with, libertarians, classic liberals, conservatives, those types. In this way, Milo Yiannopoulos is just like Armored Skeptic. The only time they apologize is when it's going to hurt their livelihoods if they don't. And they may be saying the right things, they may be using logic, they may be using fact, they may be correct in their debates, but if the side they were on was not profitable for them, if they did not both create a niche that allows them to make their livings off of these talking points, I do not believe either Armored Skeptic or Milo Yiannopoulos would be conservatives at all. I think that even if Milo does know that what he's saying is correct, as far as history, as far as contextualizing all of these progressive ideas and all of these progressive movements, even if he knows that what he's saying is correct, the absolute second that this persona of his, that these talking points of his, that this niche of his stopped being profitable, he would drop it and find something else to do the second. And I believe that beyond a shadow of a doubt. It was that, and then kind of, what he did to Margaret. I don't want to white knight for somebody just because I look up to them, but the way he treated Margaret when she wanted him to actually delegate work to her on the privilege fund, and he just started ignoring her and then snubbed her later when he hired someone else to take over her position, was just utterly spineless and reprehensible. Then he did the same thing to that guy with the mullet, who was like part of his little Mean Girls clique. Baked Alaska, that was his name. He did the same thing to this guy, where not only does he violently eject someone from his circle like he's the cheer captain in middle school, but he tells everybody else that if they associate with those people, if they legitimize anything that those people say, they'll be out too. I think that he's been provocative in a way that obviously has attracted a lot of young people, but I think his cruelty has also kind of hardened the divide between the left and the right. And the kind of people he makes fun of, he's not converting them. He's making you feel good about things that you already believe about social justice, and that's profitable for him. But he makes no attempt to be, compassionate to the other side. It's going to benefit him in the short term and hugely, deeply harm the conservative movement in the long run. When it comes to this current situation, it's definitely a tough one. I think Milo is the antithesis of sincere in the vast majority of things he says. However, it seemed like in the clip I saw of him talking to Joe Rogan, this might have been one of the most authentic versions of Milo that we've seen. I think that the more Joe kind of pressed and tried to get him to acknowledge the atrocities that he was just flippantly discussing that happened to him and that he has seen happen to other children, he kind of became meek and a little bit dismissive and a little bit timid. Normally, when he says all kinds of absurd things, it's just glossed over. When he's performing, when he's on stage doing his act, being the Milo persona, nobody can really stop him. Where if you're on a show and the radio show host is asking you, who did this? What were the names of these people? How old were you? When did this happen? Why didn't you tell somebody about this? You can't really steer the conversation where you want. Nothing he said there to me condones pedophilia. And even if he were to overtly condone it, so little of what he says, so little of him is sincere that I would not put it past him to condone something just sick and atrocious like that just for attention. He's using that persona, that very kind of snide, flippant, sort of nihilistic persona to deal with something horrible that happened to him. It doesn't make it right that he didn't report what he allegedly saw at parties. It doesn't make it right that he didn't try to do something to protect kids in the future. Even if you are a victim and you want to protect yourself, when other people are at risk of going through the horrible things you go through, I don't think that you have the right to selfishly, remove yourself from that situation when that situation is going to be the same living hell for other people in the future if you let it go. That being said, it seems as if he was using that persona, as I said before I got off on like 18 tangents, his very flippant, dismissive, kind of horribly nihilistic and cynical persona to deal with something horrible that happened to him by downplaying it, by acting like it wasn't a horrible thing, by saying, oh, I was a very mature 14-year-old, and something along the lines of, if anyone was being molested or sexually harassed, it was him, or if anyone was doing the molesting, it was me. Those are examples of him trying to take ownership of and try to spin this situation as if he had control over the fact that he was being assaulted, sexually assaulted by an older man. And whether or not that happens a lot in the gay community doesn't make it okay, doesn't make it any less horrific and inhuman and evil. But it seems to me, genuinely, as if he is using defense mechanisms wherein he acts like he was in control of the situation, or, it was kind of a consensual, forbidden, exciting tryst. When it's like, no, somebody did something absolutely evil to you, and something horrible, unspeakably horrible, and mentally destructive happened to you. But if you pretend that, you were a very mature teenager when you were molested, or you pretend that you were the one who was making the moves on that person and, you kind of forced them or pressured them into complying with this activity, then you don't ever have to acknowledge what happened to you. You can continue to deny and delay the trauma that you are going through inside and ignoring if you continue to pretend for as long as you can as if you were in control of that situation, as if, well, it happens all the time in the minority community I fit into, or, well, I was very mature for my age. If you're able to downplay these things, you're able to stave off the inevitable complete implosion and destruction of your psyche that's going to happen after something like that happens to you. And in those cases, you're doing horrible harm to yourself. I mean, I know unspeakably awful things happen to people all the time, and many, many people have to go through life trying to put the pieces back together and figure out how to function when something beyond comprehension and beyond our ability to cope is inflicted upon them. But the longer you put that off, the worse it's going to get. Trust me, I've got, a whole Tumblr bio full of things wrong with me mentally, and the worst thing you can do is deny what happened to you. The worst thing you can do is to kind of quash it and pretend it didn't happen, or to act like you were complicit in it and blame yourself. Something can be very common without being okay. Something completely sick and evil can be commonplace, can happen all the time. I do think that Milo has an obligation, because he is such an influencer, if you will, because he has so many fans, and because, his speaking, his narrative, his own thoughts and philosophy are how he makes his living and are, a product consumed by many, many people. I guess not normalize molestation. At the same time, I don't expect that from Milo, because Milo has never taken on any kind of moral responsibility. He's never felt responsibility to do anything differently or to try to positively use his influence to make the world a better place, ever. It's completely unrealistic to, set the standard that high, to expect Milo to do anything constructive or responsible or conscientious in any way with his platform, whether he's speaking on stage or talking to Joe Rogan in a one-on-one interview. I don't really have a clear stance one way or the other on this, because I know that when you go through something horribly traumatic, it does warp your mind. And Milo is so absolutely brilliant and masterful in his crafting of his own narratives and his own realities. And I do genuinely believe that he believes in his persona, and I do think that on some level, if you can downplay the fact that somebody sexually abused you as a child, somebody who's in a position where they should have been safe and kind and decent, I do think on some level, as long as he is in denial, as long as he denies what happened, as long as he downplays it and tries to spin it and categorize it as something much less heinous than it was, he doesn't have to ever actually lie awake at night looking at the ceiling, or, be sitting in the back of the car, or be, in bed with somebody and actually realize, oh my God, I was raped. So I do think it's a defense mechanism. And I understand that you have to recognize that when somebody's been through a trauma like that at the hands of another human being, especially, they're not going to be rational about what happened. PTSD and depression and anxiety and agoraphobia and things would not be disorders if they were rational. When your mind is pushed to its limits, when you are forced to try to comprehend and cope with something that the human mind, no matter how brilliant, is not capable of comprehending or coping with, you're going to develop some techniques to try and deal with this. Whether it turns into PTSD, whether you have agoraphobia and you're scared to go outside, whether you're just in denial about what happened. But at the same time, if any of this actually did happen, he let it go. He knew it was happening to everybody else. He knew that the same person would probably offend again with other people, and he didn't do anything about it. I really don't like Milo. I said this to my friend earlier. I really don't like him, but I'm kind of leaning toward being on his side in this case. Not in that he advocates for pedophilia. If he does, that's absolutely sick. But I don't think that what he said in several interviews that have now been spliced together long after they came out are damning in that way. I don't think he's advocating for pedophilia. I genuinely think my interpretation of this is that as long as he pretends that what happened to him is completely normal and is super blasé about it, he doesn't have to acknowledge that something disgusting and evil and horrifying happened to him. And then he doesn't have to deal with it. Then he doesn't have to go through that trauma. Then he doesn't have to come to terms with the fact that he was completely used and victimized and had no control over what happened to him. I don't really have a conclusion for this other than those are my thoughts. Everybody who loves Milo was jumping to his defense. Everybody who despises him was just absolutely elated with this opportunity to, try to discredit him. If you ever endure anything like this, or if you have in the past, I'm so, so sorry. Please don't listen when somebody tries to normalize things. Things may happen constantly. Things may happen to a good portion of mankind. That does not make them okay. That does not mean that you are in control. And it's okay to admit that there are situations in which you have no control. It's okay to admit that people have used you and hurt you. And in fact, the sooner you kind of sit with those emotions and deal with them and acknowledge the horrible things that I'm sure have happened to you, because we've all had horrible things happen to us in different ways, the happier and the healthier you will be. Because while it's absolute hell to go through something like that, to have to reconcile yourself with those emotions and to have to process all of that stuff and kind of grieve for yourself or those around you who have been hurt, the longer you wait, the more cancerous, the more rotten, the more toxic all of that trauma will become. And the more you internalize it, the more it will destroy you mentally and ultimately physically, because if your mental health deteriorates beyond a certain point, no amount of being in like prime condition physically is going to save you. So please don't be afraid to acknowledge the awful things in life. It's really, really important to try not to be in denial about anything like that. And even though I think everybody has ulterior motives, I am glad that people are taking this as seriously as they are. And it's hard to feel bad for Milo because I think he's a very, very bitter, very disingenuous, very kind of opportunistic person. But at the same time, what he has discussed is something that, a lot of people relate to and that is relevant to a lot of people. So it was important to talk about. I love you guys so much. Thank you for watching. Please let me know what you think as well. It's totally fine if you think the opposite of me. All I ask is for respect and for us to continue kind of having healthy, well-rounded, respectful debates in the YouTube comment section. I mean, we're miracle workers here, people. I didn't know this was possible. So that's about it. And I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. Bye.